Okay, I'm gonna let everybody in a second. Welcome. Great. Welcome to all. Welcome to our audience and to our two distinguished guest speakers. We're live now. The topic of today's event was triggered by several signals from the regulatory, business, and tech ecosystem that key global stakeholders must address privacy concerns and ensure digital trust given the meteoric rise of the metaverse or metaverses, as we'll hear later on today. For our roundtable discussion, I'm looking forward to hearing insights from our two guests that have generously agreed to share their insights regarding compliance and digital ethics in the metaverse. Today, our agenda will aim to highlight key digital ethics and compliance lessons learned from previous deployments of emerging technology, as well as main drivers of success when we design and deploy proactive digital ethics and compliance programs for the metaverse. We'll hope to conclude with sharing optimal methods to harmonize metaverse ethics and compliance programs with the existing enterprise or national digital strategy. And please allow me now to briefly introduce our guest. Leonardo Calini is currently serving as the Public Policy Manager for Economic Policy at Meta. He is a globally renowned EU technology and public policy professional with years of in-house experience in tech firms. Currently, he is part of Meta's EU Affairs team, and he's working on competition policy, platform regulation, data sharing, and the metaverse. Also, additionally, he's a prolific contributor to several publications and media channels, speaking at prestigious worldwide events. Thank you for joining us. If our audience can please mute, that would be great. Thank you so much. And then Dr. Reid Blackman is the CEO and founder of Virtue, where he works with companies to integrate ethical risk mitigation into the development and deployment of artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies. He's also the author of Ethical Machines, a recently published book from Harvard Business Review. He also serves as a senior advisor to the Deloitte AI Institute, was a founding member of Ernst & Young's Artificial Intelligence Advisory Board, and volunteers his time to the not-for-profit Government Blockchain Association as a chief ethics officer. He has published in numerous venues. His work is profiled in the Wall Street Journal, and he speaks at events and businesses around the world. Thank you again for joining us. And prior to starting with our main agenda, I would love for each of you to share your own metaverse definition, because we know in the social media venues, often we have all kinds of definitions that cause not only confusion, but sometimes also misinformation. So maybe we'll start with you, Dr. Blackman, and then Leonardo can share his view. Go ahead.
Oh man, I was hoping that he would go first. Okay, so I suppose the way that I think about the metaverse is just as user interface, whatever that is going to look like exactly, for, as various technologies get developed and integrated. So I think about the, underlying the metaverse are all these different kinds of emerging technologies: AI, blockchain, IoT, edge computing, quantum computing, et cetera. And the metaverse is just the set of, interactive or user experiences that will result from the applications or the software that's built on top of all these technologies. I lost your audio, I think.
Leonardo, thank you so much for your definition, Reid. Leonardo, what's your view?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ingrid. And I wanted to thank you for hosting us today, and also Reid for taking the time, and every one of you who's joining online, taking the time to join us in the discussion. I think I'm very happy that we're starting off with the possibly the hardest of the questions. What is the metaverse? And I think Reid has years and years of experience in this field. I am sort of a public policy professional and a lawyer. Sometimes it gets quite tricky to understand what really the metaverse is, especially as you mentioned, there are a lot of misconceptions. I mean, I think this is normal when you're dealing with something that seems coming out of a science fiction. I think something that is helpful for me very much, not being a data scientist, is actually trying to focus on what, rather than what the metaverse does, what are users gonna be able to do in the metaverse. I think really thinking about the use cases and what are the opportunities that will be provided in the context of the metaverse. And I think really with that approach in mind, I think the opportunities are immense. I mean, also when it comes to like, with every technological advancement, there's also some challenges that we're going to have the chance to touch upon later on. But with that approach in mind, the metaverse really is the evolution of the internet, is the next generation of the internet, is a new way in which we will experience the internet. I think over the last few years, we have seen the way we experience the internet change quite dramatically and quite fundamental. We used to have computers in our basements, then computers moved to our desktop, and now computers move to our pocket. And I think at least for the last 15 years, we had computers in our pockets. I think 2007 was really the year in which smartphones became mainstream, and we're all familiar with the consequences of it, of how our interaction with the internet changed since that. And I think this is really what the promise of the metaverse is. I think we should expect a significant change, a significant shift in the way the internet will become more immersive as a result of it, by not just simply taking a smartphone out of your pocket, but by wearing a pair of smart glasses, which is the hardware that my company Meta is currently developing, which will enable the experience the internet without having to sort of take your smartphone out of your pocket, navigate through an interface. You have everything in a smart device, in a smart glass. You will interact with a virtual assistant that will project holograms, your email, your news, your weather. I every day I wake up opening the weather, and as an Italian living in Brussels, I'm often disappointed. So I will be disappointed in the future when I'll see the weather in the metaverse. But this is really what it is. It's another way in which we'll experience the internet, one that I'm very much looking forward to.
Thank you. I really appreciate both those definitions, and I think it's helpful for our audience to hear it from all of you. I also encourage our audience to look up reputable sources in general for anything related to the metaverse, because like we mentioned, unfortunately, we see a lot of misinformation. And now I would like to kick our roundtable off with the first question. We've all deployed emerging technologies for several years, and I was wondering if you can share with our audience, what can we learn from the past, good and bad, and how can we extrapolate some of the work that has already been done for years so that we can get a head start with the metaverse and not have to start fresh? As we know, a lot of time was spent by numerous global key stakeholders to develop the current digital policies. So what, if anything, can we use? And two, what will be different? So Reid, can you start? And then Leonardo will go next.
Yeah, so I suppose I'll focus on two things. One thing to say is the thing that we've learned is that it takes a long time for an organization to actually figure out what its digital ethical risk program should look like, and then actually creating it. It's a long haul. It's a long journey. I don't think myself that there's some sense in which it's relatively straightforward as to what needs to be done. I don't think the difficulty, frankly, on the condition that you've been studying and researching and practicing this stuff for, many years, it's in some sense, it's not that hard. The hard part is getting the organizational will to actually engage in the organizational change that's required. So that's the hard bit. That's one thing to say, because it's going to take a long time. It requires lots of education. It requires lots of buy-in. And then it requires actually taking concrete steps. So maybe you start with a digital ethics statement. Maybe you start building a framework to articulate how does your digital ethical risk program fit into existing governance structures. So that all needs to get done, perfectly doable, on the condition that you've got sufficient organizational will, you've got buy-in to do it, which requires some new leadership. That's the sort of first thing to say that we've learned. The second thing that I think that people need to focus on, and one thing that I think we've learned in the AI space, is that people rush to try to figure out what to do without actually understanding what the problems are. So people will see the headlines around biased AI and say, we need to stop biased AI. Then they don't know what to do. Then they come out with a statement that says we're for fair AI. And then they say, okay, well, how do we operationalize it? And part of the problem is that they didn't bother, frankly, to dig deep into, well, what are the sources of bias or discriminatory AI? Because if you don't know what the sources are, then you're never going to be able to figure out what the appropriate bias mitigation strategies and tactics are, let alone who should execute on them. So I think that understanding what the ethical risks are, and more specifically what the sources of those ethical risks are, is really important, certainly in the AI space. And the same is true with the metaverse or other emerging technologies more generally, because the point is that the ethical risks, certain kinds of ethical risks are likely to be realized given how the technology works. That's the key thing. So because AI works the way that it does, more specifically because machine learning is in the pattern recognition business, it might recognize discriminatory patterns. It might recognize patterns that are too complex for mere mortals to understand. That's the black box problem. Similarly, because the way blockchain works, we're going to have certain kinds of, and insofar as blockchain undergirds the metaverse, we're going to have ethical risks that are highly likely given the way that blockchain works. We're going to have ethical risks given the way AR, VR, MR works. We're going to have certain ethical risks that are likely given the way quantum works. And so part of the digital ethics efforts need to be directed at a deeper understanding of how the technologies work in such a way that they increase the probability of certain kinds of risks being realized so that appropriate risk mitigation strategies can be devised and executed on. And
Thank you.
End rant.
It's okay. Well, and I think you touched on the fact that we hear oftentimes from enterprises that they don't truly understand until they start on this journey how long and how deep the process has to be to deploy digital ethics programs. It's not coming in a box, and it's not an easy downloadable software always. So it's very important to understand that. Leonardo, what can you share from your experience with compliance? Is it similar? Is it different? Is it even harder? Let us know what you encountered.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. I very much agree with Reid in making the comparison with AI. I think that AI and metaverse are different types of technologies, and I think they do raise unique challenges. And the metaverse compared to AI does raise unique opportunities and challenges. But I do think that I think it took a bit of time for. I mean, I'm based in Brussels. I'm working closely with the policy making in the European Union, and I think it took a bit of time for us to go from ethics to regulation. And in the space of AI, we made an insurmountable amount of progress in the last 5 years in moving from a discussion fully based on ethics, which is extremely important, but also moving to a regulatory framework that can actually, may introduce first binding requirements that companies must abide by when it comes to developing AI-based technologies. I do think that we don't have to start from scratch with the metaverse. I think that we share some similarities with AI-based technologies where we have to root the development of applications in the context of the metaverse in the same ethical principles that we have developed for AI, at least in the European Union. Principles of fairness, privacy, non-discrimination, I think well-established principles. I do think that we have to stress test the metaverse again to make sure that we understand whether there are some things that are really unique. And I think there are some parts of the metaverse and some components of the metaverse that are not really do not share much with AI-based technology. So it might be that we have to have a discussion about the ethics for the metaverse specifically, but I do also think that we have a lot of things to leverage on when it comes to AI. And I think two things I would like to mention in particular. First of all, one thing that the AI and the metaverse might have in common is a discussion around use cases, and in particular around high risk, medium risk, and low risk use cases. This is how the European Union decided to go about when it comes to regulation, layer the various use cases and labeling them into categories from high risk to medium risk to low risk, and with proportionate regulation based on how risky your application is for individual or for individual rights or for society as a whole, the more stringent regulation will become for you. And I think this is something that we'll see for the metaverse going forward as well. I mean, something that is high risk for AI might not be high risk for the metaverse. So I think it's an exercise that we have to continuously do over time. But it is something that I think we have the two topics have in common. The second aspect is very much was what I think Reid was touching upon, sort of the regulatory, more like not really the regulatory, like the internal accountability structure that companies must develop to assess how tools impact individuals and society as a whole early in the development stage. I mean, me as a public policy professional, as a lawyer, I've, especially early in my career, I've always regarded as law as a field to intervene always like later on in the development stage. You know, only when you market a technology, you deal with the consequences and you go to court whenever there are problems occurring. I do very much think that with the GDPR first, but also with the AI discussion now, there's something changing in the EU whereby companies are expected to assess how their creations impact the world early in the development stage. I mean, with the GDPR, we have the data protection impact assessment. With the AI, we have the AI-based impact assessment to assess, you know, the impact on non-discrimination, on fairness, on privacy, and so many other aspects. I do very much think that that's something that, again, the metaverse and AI have in common, and it's also, you know, as Reid was saying, is an area where companies need to step up investment and efforts, and because it's not necessarily coming from regulation, it has to come from the need of ensuring that these technologies are ultimately value additive. So I really think that these structures can ensure that technologies remain value additive, which was always going to be the compass moving forward when it comes to technologies such as AI and the metaverse.
Great, and I think you both touched also on the timing. Our next question addresses some of the challenges, so I hope you can maybe also address that if you can read first. What are the major challenges that you think we'll encounter when designing and deploying ethics programs for the metaverse? And then also, what are the opportunities we have? Of course, if we want to design and deploy a state-of-the-art program, what would be the drivers of success? You're on mute, Reid, if you can unmute real quick.
That's too bad. I said the smartest thing I'm going to say all session. That just that you missed it. Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest problem is the one that I articulated, which is just that you need senior leadership really driving this and making sure that there is organizational buy-in, or there's the political will to do it, that it's not some side project. It's not something that maybe we do or we kind of do, or yeah, okay, let's sort of dip our toe in it. No, you got to actually commit to it if you're going to do it for real. So the biggest challenge is getting the internal political will to make it happen. The drivers for success, I mean, I think one of them is having a senior level cross-functional team. So I think one of the big mistakes that organizations make with, say, AI ethics is they think, oh, this is a technology problem. This is for the data scientists to figure out. And it's absolutely true that data scientists, AI engineers, et cetera, need to be involved in the solution, but they're frankly a relatively small part of the solution, because what is required is creating or amending or both certain kinds of governance structures, oversight by non-data scientists, those who understand the ethical implications, the regulatory and legal implications, the reputational implications, the business implications. And if you don't have that cross-functional team involved in the creation of the framework that you're going to ultimately bring to life within the organization, then you're going to fail. Because, you know, if you've got this business unit over here working on it, and they build this framework, and then they knock on their neighbor's door, down the office door, remotely or not, they're going to say, wait, what are you talking? What do you mean? We don't want to do that. We're not doing it, right? So it's easy to meet a bunch of obstacles along the way, politically speaking. And so the crucial thing is going to be let's get cross-functional buy-in from senior leadership and have them involved in the creation of the framework. Because if you can get that framework right, if you get buy-in on what it's going to look like across the enterprise, it's going to be a lot easier to start creating the standards and implementing, scaling, maintaining, et cetera.
Thank you. And Leonardo, what do you think are the biggest challenges and then opportunities, or the key drivers of success that you think will be essential?
I think I do very much agree with what Reid has just mentioned. I think one of the challenges that I see in particular when it comes to both AI and the metaverse is the need to ensure that the teams that you devote to running the impact assessment do come from and reflect diverse cultures, people with diverse cultural background, gender, cultural diversities, because that's really where I think some of the problems related to biases are coming from, both in the context of AI. We might see the same problems emerging in the future. So I think, it's not easy task, one, to build an internal structure to enforce meaningful accountability because of some of the structural problems of data science itself. We've often discussed about the gender gap in data science, and this is one of the consequences that this creates is actually problems when it comes to running machine learning. So I think these remain, at the moment, still some of the challenges that companies need to be aware when it comes to building an impact assessment, a meaningful impact assessment, one that can, as I mentioned before, drive and this value additive innovation that needs to start from the early phases and not later on in the process. You don't want to adjust the technology later on. You want to start with the right food. And this is something that is really important for AI, but also for the metaverse. If I can just touch upon very quickly about some of the other aspects of the metaverse that I think really emerge as challenge, and I will also touch upon quickly on the solutions that might help address these challenges, is that I really like to think as the metaverse as 3 layers. You have the hardware, you have the software that is running on top of the hardware, and then you have the use case. And I think the discussion that we are having in Reid is really meaningful for the use cases that are going to be deployed once you have the hardware and the software put in place. But I do really think that in the context of the metaverse, there are also some of the challenges down the line when it comes to the hardware and the software that also will have to be addressed. I mean, we're seeing that we just have to open the news and understand what the microeconomics conditions are at the moment when it comes to developing smart glasses or other hardware for AR, VR technologies. I think there are value chain disruptions. There is a shortage of microchips. So there are various, elements at the moment that are playing against a smooth spread of headsets in the next few years. So I think going beyond ethics and compliance, I think there are some other challenges in the space of hardware that must be addressed as well. When it comes to the software operating system, which is bridging the hardware and the applications, I think that one of the opportunities of the metaverse is that to be successful, it has to be open. So it has to be open in the sense that the way we experience internet today is pretty much disrupted and fragmented across different types of services. You have operating systems that are tied to a certain hardware. I think when it comes to the metaverse and the promise of the metaverse can only be successful if users can really freely move across these different spaces. And I think the concept of interoperability is one that will become extremely crucial. I mean, we're seeing it recently with the formation of the first standards group. So I think, there are various considerations to make in this space. I think the first two, hardware and software, are important. But again, I also want to underline that once you have perfect hardware, you have an open and interoperable metaverse, you want to make sure that the users are ultimately value additive. So I think going back to the points raised by Reid, I think, there has to be an incredible amount of focus into that third layer in making sure that users remain value additive.
Absolutely. And then we had also, you mentioned interoperability, which is definitely very important, but what we also encounter sometimes a challenge for organizations to integrate all the aspects you just both mentioned, but then also how to integrate it with existing enterprise strategies. So what should they do? How should they approach this integration? Should they first deploy what they have now and develop a separate program for the metaverse, or should they harmonize and try to synchronize their efforts? I think that's a question that we get quite often. So Reid, maybe you start. How would you integrate ethics and compliance programs, and what should be the optimal cadence and sequence to accomplish that?
So, what we see a lot of, so first of all, there's many companies who haven't done anything yet around, say, AI ethical risks. They're just hoping that nothing bad happens. So there's nothing to integrate, or there's existing risk and compliance, but not existing ethical risk mitigation stuff around, say, AI or big data. For those, so what we usually recommend with those clients is, listen, don't just create an AI ethical risk program, create a digital ethical risk program. Now, it's got to integrate obviously with existing governance structures. You can't just sort of, create this siloed program. It's got to get woven into existing processes, existing boards, existing committees, existing tools for risk identification and mitigation, and decision procedures for what you do when the risk is high versus medium versus low. So it all has to get folded in. in an ideal world, what especially multinationals should be doing is creating a digital ethical risk program, including the metaverse, which in my definition of metaverse will ultimately include AI and AR, VR, MR, and right, all the emerging technologies. And then they should be, as it were, plugging in modules that are particularly relevant to what it is that they are building in-house or procuring. So you might have a digital ethics program that has a sort of, if you like, an AI module, might have a blockchain module, might have a quantum module, might have an IoT module, might have a on and on and on. And that digital ethical risk program, since it's already built to integrate with the existing governance structures, when they add a new module, it should be relatively seamless. What you don't want to do is build an AI ethics program that's really tailored to AI, and then you have to figure out, oh, okay, oh, no, now we have to do blockchain and quantum and all the metaverse stuff. Now we have to sort of rejigger that whole thing and redo it. Do we tear it down? Do we add on to it? Do we sort of bolt on metaverse stuff to the existing AI oversight and governance? That's not ideal. So the big recommendation is to make it a digital ethical risk program into which you can input various kinds of modules that are technology specific. Did I answer your question?
I think it's a great start, absolutely. And then Leonardo, what's your opinion?
I mean, first of all, I do very much agree with what Reid is just saying, but I also really think that when it comes to, I think it's also important to distinguish the role of the company, sort of what is that a company should put in place in terms of accountability structure, and what must the law focus on. So what should come from regulation, what should come from legislation. I think, that's clearly not everything. I mean, companies cannot be and should not be, it's not actually the role of the companies to solve all of these issues. I think it's also important that if the accountability, the right framework for accountability doesn't come from the company itself, regulations should step in to incentivize the types of innovation that are value additive. And I think we're seeing the right balance currently in the European Union. I think, there is a currently ongoing debate around a proposal, which is, as I mentioned before, regulating for the first time artificial intelligence. It wasn't an easy path towards achieving this proposal. I mean, it took quite some time to move, as I mentioned before, from ethics to regulation. And I think the two have to work together. I mean, in the European Union, the principles that are enshrined in the proposal really come from ethical frameworks. So it's a principle around fairness, non-discrimination, principle that are well established and no one should actually challenge in principle, despite there was an overwhelming support for this principle across the board from various parts of the world. We have seen frameworks for digital ethics and ethics for AI really saying the same thing at the end of the day, which is something that, coordinated a lot of this effort. But it is also a role for technology, for regulation, to make sure that that I think the role of regulation specifically is to incentivize the types of innovation that are at the end of the day value additive. So I think coordination is necessary, but there is a role both for regulation and for companies in driving sort of this coordination together.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing to that, which is that's exactly what we saw. I always like to talk about the healthcare industry and the way in which there are regulations in healthcare, and in particular research on human subjects. There's regulations around that. And those regulations originally came from a document written primarily by a philosopher, an ethicist in particular, who said, look, these are the 3 ethical principles that should guide medical research: justice, respect for persons, and beneficence. That eventually got turned into regulations, at least in the US. That was the Belmont report, which got turned into regulations. So the regulations were meant to enshrine those principles in law. And I think that's exactly what we have going on here. We have digital ethical risks, metaverse ethical risks, AI ethical risks, call it whatever you want. But those ethical risks need to, and thankfully are, at least at the beginning, getting turned into regulation. So yeah, I think we're totally on the same page.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to spend our last 15, 20 minutes trying to address some of the phenomenal questions that our audience is sending. So one, we've seen a push from California to differentiate something for children versus adults. From California to differentiate something for children versus adults. Can you both comment on, should we have something that's separate? Are there elements that can be combined? And if so, which ones?
So
Reid,
I'm
you
not,
can start first and then we'll take that. Yeah, go ahead.
sure. I mean, if you're talking from a sort of an ethical risk perspective, I mean, one should always do when you're trying to assess the risk of a particular, say, to use Leonardo's words, use case or an application, is identify the stakeholders. And many times the stakeholders are going to include children, the elderly, the vulnerable, et cetera. So I think that if you built a robust, effective digital ethical risk program in your corporation, then one thing you're good at doing is identifying relevant stakeholders, including children. So there's nothing over and above you've got to do. Now, do regulations need to specifically call out impacts on children? I don't know. That's for Leonardo.
So Leonardo, I want to take a step.
Yeah, thanks, Ingrid. I do very much echo what Reid is saying, in the sense that I think when it comes to, I mean, the whole reason why you should have an impact assessment is that you want to understand the impact of what you're creating into various types of people and various range of stakeholders. And I do think that when you run this test for minors and when you run the same test to adults, I think the outcome of that assessment might be very different. It might be the same, but it might be very different. And I think that one of the considerations to make is to it's just actually make sure that the impact assessment that you run for the metaverse, for a metaverse technology, for AI-based technology, it has as nuance as going to assess the impact not only on the category that you're trying to test your technology against, but also the level of the age of the group that compose this categories of people. So I think this is underlying one of the challenges that I think of the breadth of the impact assessment actually companies should run, and just it has to be very nuanced. It's not an easy task. It's really challenging, and that's, I think, explaining the challenge of private sector in actually deploying effectively and smooth impact assessment when it comes to these technologies. It has to be as complex as understanding the impacts on these various categories of people to be meaningful. Otherwise, it's just going to be misleading. So to answer the question, I do think that it requires different types of assessments, and it's one of the things that make this impact assessment quite challenging in the first place, but one that is necessary. I think this is something that we must all agree on, that is necessary and must be done with sufficient resources and investment.
This is one topic I can't help myself, but I'm going to say something as well, as someone that spent my first 8 years in the pediatric ethics realm and then also for pediatric compliance. I do think there are two topics in addition to everything that both of you mentioned that require special attention, and that's informed consent in pediatric population is totally different. And then also the digital identity safeguards. I think we have several complexities there. If you are 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 11, it's a little bit different than if you are 16 or above. So I agree that we have some work to do. And I do believe, just as my personal opinion, that for children, probably not only impact, but also the guardrails and safeguards might have to be a little bit different to ensure good outcomes. So we have a bunch of other questions. Number one, when you mentioned Reid healthcare, we got a question on, how do we think about oaths, like the Hippocratic Oath, for an example? How does that play a role in the ethics and compliance element? And then I'm going to add something to that came from another audience member. Do we need a metaverse code of ethics, and do we need a more robust guideline there and oath and ethics program, or can we devise something that encompasses all of these?
So I think probably we could devise something that would encompass all of these things. Do we need a sort of, data science Hippocratic Oath or a metaverse, Hippocratic Oath? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting empirical question as to the extent to which that oath actually has an impact on anyone's behavior. I don't know the answer to that. So I'd love for someone to investigate. Hey, I don't know how we control that variable. The world with a Hippocratic Oath and the world without the Hippocratic Oath, is it a different one? Because there's lots of controls in place for protecting people in healthcare. The Hippocratic Oath is a nice, thing, but is it as important as, for instance, institutional review boards? At least that's what they call them in the US. They call them other things. Are the review boards playing more of a protective function? I don't know. Probably. That's my instinct. So oaths are nice, codes of conduct are nice, but the question is whether those things actually trickle down to process, practice, oversight, risk ratings, clear accountability frameworks, that sort of thing. The other thing that I want to mention is, and I don't know what, I'd actually be interested to hear what Leonardo thinks about this. I think that as far as I can see, and I know they're not perfect, but IRBs or review boards that medical researchers have to consult before they can actually do their medical research are comprised of, ideally anyway, cross-functional team. There's lack of conflict of interest. And it seems to me that those review boards have been crucial in safeguarding people or patients or subjects of medical experiments. And we don't see anything like that when there's talk of AI regulation, metaverse regulation, having something like independent review boards playing a role, which I find kind of shocking might be the wrong word, but deeply unfortunate, because it seems to me like that's a phenomenally powerful tool that has worked, I think, largely worked in the healthcare space, and I don't see why it would work in the tech space. It seems to me odd that we say, look, doctor, medical researchers can't be relied upon to do their own self-assessments, and they need to seek independent IRB approval, but the data scientists can do it by themselves. I'm not sure how data scientists have that kind of, internal moral compass in a way that, say, medical researchers don't. So I think that's a lesson to be learned from healthcare regulation that, as far as I can see, we've completely failed to carry over and to take that learned lesson from healthcare and apply it to regulations of metaverse, AI, et cetera.
Right. And Leonardo, we have one for you specifically also, given your background in law, of course. One of our audience members notes that law and regulation have always played catch up, and now with the advances in technology, we have another gap between these three. How can we do a better job to get all three at the same pace and address them appropriately, as opposed to always be behind? So it has happened now for many years. Is there something we can do different for this time?
Thanks, Ingrid. I think this is a really, really great question. I do think that, as we've witnessed, especially in the EU in the last few years, really, it's been really the theme, I think, when it comes to regulation, really trying to, especially in civil law countries where you're trying to write what a technology does, what a technology should do, what a technology shouldn't do. And when you're listing types of technologies that are covered by a certain proposal, it gets outdated even before it gets into force most of the time. So unfortunately, this is one of the trends that we're seeing, that regulation is really struggling to, be future-proof. At least this is one of really the efforts that policymakers are driving in Europe to future-proofing regulation in a way that is addressing how technology evolves over time. I do think that this is an unresolved issue. The approach that we're seeing at this moment in time is to make regulation very broad, sort of with a catch-all type of approach, very generic definitions when it comes to defining technologies, very vague concept when it comes to the types of obligations that are introduced, because this is one of the reactions to this challenge of the catch-all necessity of regulation. One of the approach that followed the struggle is to make regulation essentially very vague and uncertain, which is exposing private sector to legal uncertainty. So I think you see the opposite interests at stake here. On one side, you want to have clear rule, but also rules that are effective and that are catching up on how technology moves going forward. I do think that ultimately the solution must come from the private sector. I think it's companies that should value responsible innovation. I think we've often discussed. Reid also highlighted the challenges in implementing an accountability structure. I think in this ultimate solution to make sure that that you achieve a sort of regulation and companies work together and ethical frameworks work together is an interest from the private sector to fill any gap that is left over by regulation. I think this has to be incentivized through regulation. This is it's an approach that I think I do understand the struggle in implementing this approach in private sector. but it's ultimately the only solution going forward. It's making sure that whenever there is a regulatory gap that is emerging, that is absorbed by an accountability structure in place in the companies. I think that I want to underline and I want to stress the challenge of actually, you know, doing that from the private sector. I think that it's also important that that we distinguish the two roles, the roles of the companies and the roles of regulation. I think that what comes from regulation is absolutely important. And I think that the gaps that are left open should not be too wide, where there shouldn't be an excessive role played by private sector, but the two have to work together to find a solution to this challenge.
So you mentioned two things that actually partially address two other questions that came in. So I'm going to advance those quickly now to you, Leonardo, just because they're very related. And then we have several for Reid. So one of our audience members is asking, how have you found a way to address some of those gaps at Meta, if you can share? And the second one is, who will have accountability? As we've seen with internet, many times enterprises do not feel accountability or responsibility for users' behavior. So who should, could, would be accountable for behaviors in the metaverse? If you have a comment, and then we'll go to Reid.
Yeah, I think answering quickly the first question, I think that the way I'm contributing and giving my own contribution is, I mean, as you all know, when it comes to the metaverse, it's a very nation stage. So at the moment, what we are doing as employees, we are having a lot of discussions with policymakers. I mean, my role is actually being an interface for policymakers in the European Union in getting feedback over the concerns that they feel when it comes to the metaverse and the way it's going to be developed. And there is a tool for us employees, but for everyone else really through interfaces like me to give feedback on how technology should develop in this space. So there is a very easy form that you can fill and say, I have tested this application and I have these numbers of concerns. And this is something that I'm doing very often with policymakers in Brussels when they have the chance to play or to interact with applications in the metaverse, just to give feedback so that feedback gets implemented into engineering. And this is something that I value very much, in having a direct a possibility myself to interact with engineering, that they can incorporate this feedback now that the technology is in a very nascent stage. I mean, this is the reason why last year we announced the metaverse and our strategy for the metaverse. We have presented the metaverse for how it will be in 10 years, not for how it is today, so that people really have an opportunity to understand what the real implications will be. And we sort of challenge them head on right now, instead of waiting for them to become the norm. So you really have, as an employee, but as anyone interested in technology, you have really an opportunity to shape the debate and make sure that it's directed in a way that that it's going to be, as I mentioned often during the discussion, value additive at the end of the day. When it comes to how the responsibility will be shared, I think the challenge of answering that question is that we really don't know what the relationships across various players will be in the context of the metaverse, because the metaverse is currently being built, but there is not enough interaction between stakeholders, if it's Meta, another company, or the users themselves, in understanding how that relationship and the corresponding accountability will have to be shaped off. I do really think that, and it is something that I really want to insist on for this discussion, is that the change must come from the companies. I think the companies need to lead by example, and I think, as I mentioned already in the previous answer to the challenge of regulation, filling the gap of regulation requires companies to step in and be proactive in addressing these risks. And I think it has to be, and I think something that we're seeing in the technology space is that if a company values about technology, and if a company values about the users, that company will become successful and will remain successful for the future, for the future as well. So I think making sure that companies feel the responsibility in the long-term value and the long-term benefit of technology is something that will be extremely valuable in the metaverse as well.
Thank you. Reid, anything further to add on these two topics, or should we go to the questions that you got?
I mean, sure. I'll just say one thing, which is that at the end of the day, the regulations are meant to be general or ought to be general by virtue of the kinds of processes that they require. So look, when we talk about regulation, there's two ways of thinking about regulation, or at least two kinds of regulation. Some are outcome-based and some are, process-based. So outcome-based ones are like, all cars must be electric by 2050 or something like that. All cars by 2035 must get at least 50 miles per gallon. So that's a particular outcome that you're requiring. We're not going to get anything like, I don't think, outcome-based regulations, at least unless it's a very, thinly described outcome. Because there are just so many applications, so many, countless ways of using these various technologies, countless ways the metaverse might manifest, so to speak. And so it's not going to be about, here's what you need to create. It's going to be more like, in your creation of the thing, here's the process that we require. And so there's going to be, so for instance, there's laws around how criminal justice proceedings have to unfold. Obviously, you want the outcome of finding the innocent and the guilty, but what you can't, as it will require that, what you can require is the process that's most likely to lead to the desirable outcome. So similarly, we're going to have regulations that focus not on outcomes, but on process, because those are the processes that we think are most likely to result in the desirable outcomes. For instance, not discriminating against people, not sexual harassing people, not killing people, not causing widespread depression, not, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's gonna have to be process oriented. And those processes can be technology agnostic, right? It doesn't have to say, in your use of AI, you have to do this process. It's going to be something like, in your use of, say, in your development of data-driven products or something along those lines. I know there's going to be, the lawyers are going to talk about what it means to be data-driven. What does that mean? Is that the same thing as data involved? Okay, whatever, put that to the side. We can word tweak later, but the regulations have to be technology agnostic in the sense that they prescribe certain, what constitutes robust processes for risk identification and mitigation. So that's one thing to say. And that's the way that you can, I think, it makes sense to develop regulations for digital ethics. They're not about particular technologies. They're about the kinds of processes that any technology driven by involving, lots of data need to undergo. And then regulations around what transparency looks like around those things. So for instance, if the regulations, I know they don't, but if the regulations required some kind of ethical risk committee or institutional review board, whatever you call it, and it had requirements around who has to sit on that board, what are the requirements for sitting on that board, what a lack of conflict of interest looks like, what kinds of decisions they need to be transparent about to the general public and or to regulators and or to other stakeholders. Those are interesting ways of holding companies accountable by requiring them to engage in a certain robust due diligence and being transparent about X, Y, and Z about what decisions were made and why. I think that would go a really long way. Okay, but that's I could probably say more, but I'll stop.
So two questions, and they're related to everything we talked, but they're a little bit more specific. So one, Reid, if you can highlight for our audience, if you are aware of any state-of-the-art ethical frameworks that companies could use, and if there is already one that an enterprise that wishes to be forward-looking, like we said, for metaverse, could actually use as an example. And the second question is, if a data breach happens, what repair methods do organizations have to address those? And particularly if they were related to AI, black box algorithms, let's say.
Okay, so the first question was, what are there state-of-the-art frameworks? And then
yes, and if the ones that you have encountered before in the AI world could be extrapolated to be used for the metaverse.
Yeah, so it depends on what is meant by framework. I find that different people mean different things by framework. Sometimes frameworks are phenomenally thin. There's not a lot to it. So here's our framework. Here's the categories of risk, and that's their framework. Okay, or here's our framework. There's going to be some due diligence that's taken on by the first line of defense, say the data scientists or product owners. And then if they smell ethical smoke, so to speak, then it gets elevated to, the product owner or something along those lines. And if there's a further thing, then it's going to get elevated to a risk committee or a set of executives or whatever. And that's our framework, So sometimes what's called a framework is really, really thin. My general sense of things is that, and this is from working with dozens of multinationals, that the frameworks, even, there's nice stuff out there, but it's generic and it's always going to have to get tailored to how the organization actually works, which is one reason why, it makes it hard to do regulation, because you can't require this particular process to go exactly this way, because that will work for some organizations and it won't work for others. So yeah, there are frameworks out there, but they're generic, and multinationals are phenomenally complex beasts, lots of moving parts, and it's about how you tailor those frameworks to the existing governance structures and processes and practices and KPIs, existing policies that the organization already has. That's where the sort of, if you like, the harder work is. So I think that's my answer to the first question. And the second question is, what do people do when there's an ethical problem?
A breach. Yes, a breach. If there's a breach, how would you repair for ethical breaches?
There's probably loads of generic things, like contact the appropriate people, blah, 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 blah. But look, the problem that I want to focus on is not what to do, but that companies don't standardly have a way of dealing with this in a systematic way now. So the question, I think, instead of is what do they do, it's, look, different acts or different responses are going to be appropriate for different kinds of breaches. It's not, you don't always do the same thing in response to every breach, because every breach happens in a context. The question is, have you developed the organizational capacity to assess the breach, to assess the context, and then respond appropriately in a way that's not just, PR. And that has to get folded into your overall digital ethical risk program or your metaverse ethical risk program, because one of the things that you'll always have to do is not just pay attention to how you design and build your metaverse application or software or hardware, but what your monitoring looks like. And that monitoring is going to have to get tied back to, okay, so we've noticed X, Y, and Z while we're monitoring. What are the controls that we have in place, given that we've identified certain risks? That a breach hasn't happened yet, we just see red flags, and what are we going to do? So whatever the response is during that spotting of red flags when you're monitoring is going to have to dovetail with what do we do when an actual, not just red flag is realized, but an actual ethical breach occurs. It's going to go back through some process that you've created for continuously improving the product that you've been monitoring all along. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what I got for now.
Thank you. So in closing, we have only a few minutes left, but if both of you can maybe comment on the topic of our future session, which is cybersecurity for the metaverse. If I can hear one closing statement on how do organizations approach combining compliance programs, cyber programs, and ethics programs, because as you can imagine, stakeholders keep hearing that they must integrate and harmonize, and it becomes increasingly difficult to integrate ethics and compliance, let alone cybersecurity efforts. So can you share a little bit how key stakeholders, and that also means investors, academicians, business leaders, legislators, how should they view this, and what can they do to integrate these three domains? Maybe Leonardo, you can start first, and we'll close with Reid because he just answered the other one.
Absolutely, thanks, Ingrid. I am not myself an expert of cybersecurity, so I'll spare you my comments about that specific aspect. But I think when it comes to one of the thoughts to conclude sort of this discussion, just thanking you again and Reid for such a and everyone online for such interesting discussion. I do think that we have analyzed quite well what are the opportunities, but also the challenges of both in the space of ethics, regulation, so on and so forth. I do think that at the end of the day, there should be a compass, there should be a North Star in all this uncertainty, which is the fact that I think a lot of things would change if innovation is rooted into a value additive approach. I do think that this has to be translated into both ethical framework and in regulation. The two have to work together, but the role of the companies is necessary to make sure that this cooperation is effective at the end of the day. So I think it's important that we have a discussion about ethics and regulation in the context of the metaverse. And I think that the role that companies can play is not an exclusive role. Companies don't have to do everything. Companies have to do what the law requires, but it's also necessary to fill in any gap in this cooperation between ethical frameworks and regulation towards achieving responsible innovation.
Thank you. Reid, anything to add on cyber and integrating cyber programs with ethics programs and compliance? We deal with that quite often, and I think it's important because I hear business leaders feeling a major challenge very often. They feel they have an amazing cybersecurity program, they don't want to mess with it, or they have an amazing compliance program and they don't want to touch it. And then you come in and want to deploy an ethics program and you cause a lot of turmoil. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm also not a cybersecurity expert. From what I gather, you have another roundtable coming up on metaverse and cybersecurity where they'll have actual cybersecurity experts involved. So that's great. I said earlier that one of the way that these things have to happen is that you need cross-functional buy-in from senior leadership. So you do need someone from, say, the CISO's office, the Chief Information Security Officer's office, to be involved in the creation of what that framework actually is. So I mentioned those generic frameworks. That's great, but your CISO is going to have something to say about what the framework should look like and how it's going to impact the cybersecurity people. It's also the case that what goes on in a digital ethics program will depend upon being able to pull it off, will depend upon the help of the cybersecurity team. So for instance, let's just take a sort of toy example. If your digital ethics program says, we're going to make sure that everyone has power over the data about them, that they can always do this, that, and the other thing with data about them. And then the cybersecurity people might say, hold on a second. In order for us to give them that kind of access, we would have to do, X, Y, and Z on our side, which is insurmountable. It's not possible. It's a 5-year process. It's it's going to be difficult to do those kinds of things. So you might make certain, if you like, decisions about what should be done with data, how it should be treated, who should have what control over that data. But from a digital ethical risk perspective, but if you don't have the knowledge, insight, buy-in, cooperation of your cybersecurity team, then it's just a piece of paper. It's going to exist on a piece of paper because you need the cybersecurity people to enable those digital ethical risk controls. So getting them involved early on is going to be crucial.
Wonderful. Thank you to our audience for the phenomenal questions and the engagement in the chat. And I encourage everyone to send us other topics you might like for future series, in addition to the cybersecurity one. And once again, thank you both for sharing your expertise and your experience generously with our audience. Thank you again. We're right on time, 1 minute before. So once again, thanks for keeping the answers concise and brief, and looking forward to our next session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
for the
you, Ingrid.
conversation. Thanks, Leonardo. Thanks, Ingrid.